Right, okay, so thank you everybody for coming to hear me speak. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk at Go Cardless. Thank you to Norberto who invited me. My name is Clare Sudbery. I'm a consultant software developer with ThoughtWorks. And I'm going to, so the title of the talk is as much as anything a request, or you could even call it a call to action. And the title is, Let's Stop Making Each Other Feel Stupid. Originally, the title was, Let's Stop Making People Feel Stupid, but I wanted to make it a bit clearer that I'm talking about each other. This is an impact that we can have on each other working in IT. I'm always interested in feedback, so if anybody has anything that they would like to tell me about the talk afterwards, good or bad, please do let me know. I'm always interested in ways I can make it better, and I always like to hear when it's gone well. And I'm going to start by asking you to close your eyes. The reason I'm going to ask you to close your eyes is because I'm going to tell you a story. If you don't want to close your eyes, you don't have to, it's fine. Okay, so the story is about a woman, a software engineer, who is arriving at her very first job as a software engineer, very excited. This is something she's not done before, but also maybe a little bit nervous. She arrives, she's the only woman there. All of the other software developers are men. This is not something that's a massive surprise to her. She's quite new to software engineering. She's only done 1 year of study. But before that, she did a maths degree. When she was studying maths at university and at A-level, she was always in a very small minority. She was the only girl studying maths. So the idea of being in that minority is not new or surprising to her. But what it does mean is that she's absorbed the idea that women are not really supposed to be good at this kind of thing. And this has been borne out by the evidence she sees in front of her eyes, because she doesn't see women doing this kind of thing. So she does have this idea that the men will probably be cleverer than her. And this is always a little worry at the back of her mind. So when in her next job, she asks if she can join the team that are doing the really clever, exciting, difficult stuff, and gets told no, she's not massively surprised. She thinks, oh, well, I'm probably not clever enough. And she keeps asking, can I join that team? They look like they're doing really interesting, exciting stuff. And she keeps getting told no. At one point, she applies for another job, a more senior job at another company, and she gets pretty much laughed out of the room, which only confirms her belief that she's just really not clever enough. So when, after 12 years, she gets made redundant, she's actually quite relieved. She leaves the industry altogether. She's had enough. She doesn't feel like she belongs in IT or that she's clever enough to do IT. Okay, you can open your eyes. So that story was about me, probably not a massive surprise. I condensed it a bit. I rearranged it slightly for the sake of the narrative, but I don't think that's a very unusual story either. And I'm not here to just talk about women. What I'm here to talk about is the phenomenon of people feeling stupid. I think that it's something that particularly applies to people who are in a minority, but I don't think it only applies to them. So what do I mean when I talk about making each other feel stupid? One of the things that I talk about is intellectual elitism. I think this is a problem that we have in this industry, and I don't think it only applies to this industry. I actually think it applies to any industry or profession where there is a high premium placed on intelligence and knowledge. I think it particularly happens in academia. I think it happens anywhere where there is an idea that you have to be really clever to do this job. Now, fair enough, you probably do, but the problem is that people judge one another quite harshly based on a perception of whether they're clever or not. So I've lost count of the number of times that colleagues of mine have come out of an interview, having interviewed somebody else, saying, oh my God, can you believe it? We just interviewed this person and they didn't know about widgets. It doesn't really matter what widgets are, but they could be anything. But people are amazed, they will express derision, they will be, oh my God, this person doesn't know about widgets. And they don't only say it in interviews, they say it about each other. So the number of times I've heard people say about their colleagues, oh my God, I just discovered that X doesn't know about widgets. And it might seem like that's okay because they're talking about somebody who's not in the room.
Good, how are you?
But it's not okay because all the people who are in the room are thinking, oh my God, are they saying those things about me when I'm not in the room? Are they going to say those things about me? What do I need to do to make sure that people are not saying those things about me? And what you get is people being quite paranoid, people being really quite worried and upset that maybe they're not clever enough and that maybe their colleagues don't think that they're clever enough. So, okay, I'm calling it intellectual elitism. What impact does it have? So we know that we have a problem in this industry, that it's actually quite difficult to recruit skilled software engineers, skilled IT professionals. These figures are from America, just based on a very quick Google. So this was from last year, and they were saying that there would be an estimated 1 million more computing jobs than applicants who could fill them by 2020. That there were more than 500,000 open computing jobs nationwide, but less than 43,000 computer science graduates the previous year. This is a problem that is true across the industry. Now, I'm not saying it's only because of intellectual elitism, but I do think that it feeds into it. Because I think people don't want to join this industry because they think that they will feel stupid. They think that they will be judged for being stupid. They think they're not going to be clever enough. So, what is one of the impacts of this problem? I think it's really evident when people start talking in jargon. And I think that I've seen this happen over and over again, where I see two people talking and I think you're not actually understanding each other. But what they're doing is they're using complex jargon rather than straightforward plain English. And the reason they're doing this is because they don't want to look stupid. So every time you learn a new piece of jargon, you're like, fantastic, I'm going to make sure I use that one because that's going to make me look really clever. And the people that you're talking to are thinking, oh God, they're really clever. I don't know what that means, but I'm not going to admit to it because I don't want to look stupid. And what you get is people constantly not understanding each other, not explaining what they mean, not asking each other what they mean because they are afraid of looking stupid. And it becomes this quite vicious cycle, I think. So what I'm going to do now is sorry, I thought that was going to be a black slide, but it wasn't. I'm going to talk a bit about imposter syndrome, which I think is another thing that is impacted by this problem. And it's one of the most obvious ones, in fact. So I think this will probably work. I'm a bit worried that I might get a domino effect, but everybody stand up. The reason I'm saying that, for those that can't see, is that I'm looking at a kind of tiered seating arrangement. But it's okay, everybody's standing up, it's fine. Right, so what I want you to do now is sit down if you've ever felt like an imposter. And by that, I mean that you were worried that you weren't really as good as your job as people thought you were, and you were going to get found out. Okay, so that impacts on a significant number of people in the room. And what's really interesting, and this happens every time I do it, is that most people sit down, and then some more people sit down, and then eventually everybody sits down. I've actually got more questions. So I was going to ask, for those who are still standing, sit down if you've ever felt stupid. Sit down if you've ever felt like you didn't know enough. Sit down if you learned something new in the last year. And then if there was anybody left, sit down if you've ever learned anything new ever. There never is anybody left. I think it's a little bit unfair because actually there's a certain amount of peer pressure, and if you're the only person there standing, you feel like you just have to sit down, even if you actually don't feel like you ever have felt like an imposter. So I am aware of that. But the point is that it's very, very common for people to feel like imposters, for people to feel stupid. But the reason I put the questions at the end, have you ever learned anything new, is because this is the crux of the matter. We need to learn new things. You cannot survive in this industry unless you learn new things. Now, by definition, that means before you learn them, you don't know them. And you can be judged for not knowing them. And this is the thing, this is what I want to get away from. If we're all judging each other for not knowing stuff, then what we're doing is preventing each other from admitting when we don't know stuff, and preventing each other from being able to just embrace learning and say, listen, I don't know about this thing. That's quite exciting. Can you help me learn about it? Well, probably not if you're first of all judging me for not knowing about it. So this is just a little story that I was going to tell about when I went to the hairdresser last year. And I did a really silly thing. And afterwards I thought, why did I do that? And I think it's actually a really good example of a general thing that people often do. So I'm not very good at hair and makeup and all that stuff. And so I tried to make it really clear to the hairdresser that I needed a haircut that wouldn't require a lot of maintenance. It had to be something that I could get out of bed in the morning, maybe run my fingers through my hair, possibly a hairbrush, but any more than that would be beyond me. So I needed a haircut that didn't require a lot of maintenance. And I thought I'd made that really clear. Halfway through the haircut, he said to me, "You do have straighteners, don't you?" I don't have straighteners. I barely know what they are. I try really hard not to rely on that kind of thing, because my experience is that when I try and use them, it just goes horribly wrong and it doesn't create the effect it's supposed to. And it's faff and it takes time and I've got better things to do in my life. So he asked me the question, he didn't, and the way that he asked it is interesting. He didn't say, "Have you got straighteners?" He said, "You do have straighteners, don't you?" And I said, "Yes." I don't. But I said I did. And the reason I said I did is because I felt like that was the right answer. I felt like that was the answer he was expecting. And I felt that if I didn't give that answer, I might be judged. So I gave the answer I thought he wanted to hear. And it was so that I wouldn't feel judged or stupid or inadequate. That's really common. So for instance, it's actually, it's one to think about when you're checking that people know things you need them to know. Make sure that you ask the question in a way that people are allowed to give an answer that suggests they might not know about something. Make sure that that is an acceptable answer, because otherwise people will just give you the answer they think you want to hear because they're worried about the impact if they don't. So I want to talk about diversity and inclusion. I hope that we can all agree that it's a good thing to have diverse teams. It's a good thing to have teams where everybody isn't the same. So the obvious examples of that are when people have different genders and when people are from different racial backgrounds. But there are loads of other ways in which people can be diverse. People can be neurodiverse. People can have brains that work in different ways. And it's a really good thing to have diversity on your teams. Now, there have been various studies that have showed that companies that are more diverse have better outcomes and they're more profitable, they make more money. That's great, but there's a lot more to it than that. So one of the reasons that you might want diversity is because, again, research shows that you get better outcomes. Now, what's really interesting, it's tempting to think that this is because if you have a diverse team, you're living in this happy utopia where everybody's just balancing each other and looking after each other, and you've got lots of nice nurturing women like giving everybody hugs all the time. Not what we do. But actually, the reason diversity is good for teams is because it does create a certain amount of friction. Because what you've got is people that disagree with one another, people that have different ideas about how to proceed, about what the customer might need, about what the best way forward is. And that means that people are challenging one another and people aren't being complacent and people are being opened up to new ways of thinking. Doesn't mean that everybody's shouting at each other all the time. It doesn't mean that you're all having a big fight constantly, but it does mean there's a bit of friction, and friction is good. You don't want complacency. You do want to be challenging one another about the way that you think and the things that you do. So that's one reason that diversity is good. Another reason that diversity is good is going back to a previous slide. We have a problem in this industry. There aren't enough people. And actually, there's a whole bunch of people that aren't even considering this industry because they don't think they fit. They don't think they look like what a computer programmer looks like. If we open the industry up to those people by taking diversity seriously, then we actually open up the number of people who want to do this job, which is a very good thing. So why am I talking about diversity in this context? Well, I've already hinted at it, but I think that when people are worried about feeling stupid, as well as worrying that they don't fit the image of what somebody in this industry is supposed to look like, then that's a double whammy. particularly if they belong to a minority such as women, where there is a general societal view that women aren't very good at technical stuff. Add that to a fear that people might think you're stupid, and you've got a whole load of reasons not to even think about joining this industry. So this is why I think that diversity is part of this, and that if we can address this, then we can be one of the things that can have a positive impact on creating more diverse workforces. Which brings us to this slide, that this is what the feedback I was given after one time that I did this talk, from a man who said, well, it was all very interesting, but I didn't really think it was for me. I felt like really you were aiming it at an audience of women. And that's because I talked about women because I'm a woman. So, you know, I based a lot of my anecdotes on my own personal experiences. But after that, I realized that I need to make it clear that just because this is something that impacts women doesn't mean that I only want to talk to women about it. Because actually, if we want to make this industry a more comfortable place, not just for women, but for anybody who feels like they don't fit in, then we need to talk to everybody about it. Everybody needs to think about how they can be more welcoming and more inclusive, and how they cannot make their colleagues feel uncomfortable. So it's particularly important that I talk to men about this, but that I talk to everybody, because there are lots of different ways in which people can be diverse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a minute to just think about whether you might have ever made anybody feel stupid. This isn't about me wanting to make you feel guilty. I'm not here to tell you off and make you feel bad. I just want you to think about it. So I'm going to give you a minute to just think about it on your own. Then I'm going to ask you to discuss it with a neighbour, and then we can bring it back to the whole group. Okay, so now just have a chat to somebody nearby about whether you believe that you might have ever made anybody feel stupid, or if you haven't, whether you've been made to feel stupid, or whether you've witnessed this kind of behavior amongst other people. Ah. Yeah, it doesn't like staying. If I want people to contribute, can I get them to use this mic? Ah, right. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, thank you. You've all got so much to talk about. This is fantastic. So I am going to ask you to come back to the room. That's interesting. So I've got my hand up, and the reason I've got my hand up is because in some contexts, people know that signal, that you put your hand up and then everybody else puts their hand up, and eventually people notice that people have got their hands up and they stop talking. And normally I do that at conferences, and I think conference audiences must be pretty well trained to do that. And then it spreads throughout the audience. But this is a different audience, so that's really interesting. Okay, so Does anybody have any stories that they want to share? So we've got these blue boxes here. If anybody has anything they want to share, if they want to grab one based on what we've just been talking about. Anybody have any examples? Everybody's too shy. That's fine. So can I just have a show of hands then for anybody who believes that they may have at some point made somebody feel stupid, whether deliberately or not? Probably not deliberately, I hope. There you go. So I'm seeing the majority of hands going up. And it is something that you can do without even realizing you're doing it. And one of the things that I've noticed is that I believe that a lot of the time people will point the finger at other people because they're worried themselves. So particularly if somebody, sometimes just in a moment of exasperation, says, oh God, so-and-so didn't know about the widgets, other people will join in, partly because then it means that it's not being directed at them. So I have a question. Do you believe in fairies? Probably not. I'm talking real fairies that live, you know, in the forests and actually fly around. Do you believe in ghosts? Possibly. I mean, there might be people who believe in ghosts. I don't personally believe in ghosts. But something that I think a lot of people do believe in is rockstar developers. So I've read a little recruiting pamphlet that was giving advice on recruitment in IT. And the advice was that you should be looking for the rockstar devs. You should be deliberately trying to recruit the rockstar developers. And the idea there is that there is this elite of developers at the top of the tree. And they're the like really, really, really super clever, amazing ones. And I mean, and again, in this thing that I read, it was explicitly stated, most developers are not. The suggestion being most of them, nah, forget about it. They're all a bit shit, really. You only want that little cream at the top. There was also a suggestion that this creme de la creme, the way you identify them is that they will get pointers. They'll be able to do pointer manipulation. A lot of modern developers might not even know what I mean by pointers, but if you've ever coded in C or C++, you might have some idea of what I'm talking about. And when we were all coding in C and C++, pointers really mattered. But in C# and a lot of other languages, in fact, most modern languages, you don't need to know about pointers. You don't need to know how to do pointer manipulation. So if you can't, does that mean I shouldn't give you a job? Well, no, obviously not. And it's actually a really, really good example of why we shouldn't be fetishistic about knowledge or particular areas of IT, because in fact, things move on. Things change constantly. New tools, new techniques, they come into the industry, and we have to learn them. And we have to encourage our colleagues to learn them, and we have to give them time and space to learn them. And we can't just expect that everybody will come to us fully formed. We have to create environments where people can learn new stuff. And so one of the things that I talk about is don't praise knowledge, praise the thirst for knowledge. And there's a whole ton of research around this. So for instance, if anybody's ever come across a woman called Carol Dweck, who writes about the growth mindset. And the idea of the growth mindset is that people who have the growth mindset are much more likely to succeed. And the growth mindset is the idea that you can change and grow and improve, and that it is your own effort that will make that happen. Because the alternative is a belief that you're just clever. You've just always been clever, and you just are. Now, you might think that that would be a good thing, because people who believe that about themselves would be super confident. But what it actually means is that people who have that mindset will not try and learn new things because they think they're supposed to know them already. And then that creates a massive problem for them when they don't. And it's not helpful. And it's not a helpful way of nurturing people to give them undirected praise. So I read a really interesting article this morning that was about child development. From a psychologist who was talking about how frustrating he finds it that whenever he's around children and parents or carers, that they will constantly be saying to them, good job. I think he was probably American, but anyway, good job, or equivalents. Now, the problem with that is it's completely non-specific. It doesn't actually tell the child what they did well or how to replicate that in the future. And the same applies to adults. That if you just say, oh, wow, you know about widgets, well done you, well, that's not actually helpful. But if you say to somebody, oh, you're learning about widgets, fantastic. I've been thinking about doing that. What can you tell me about widgets? When you praise people for putting the effort in, when you praise people specifically about the things that they are doing to reach a particular outcome, then you're giving them useful praise and you're actually encouraging behavior that you want to see, rather than just saying, you're great. Well, so that's not helpful to me. I mean, it's quite nice, but it's not really very helpful. And the idea of rockstar developers, the idea that there are some people who are better than everybody else and most of us are not, is really not helpful. And it's certainly not going to help you with recruitment if you're trying to grow, because, you know, there's a limited number of these mythical beasts out there. And they're not necessarily people you want on your team if they've been encouraged to think that they're better than everybody else, because that's not actually a helpful attitude to have. But still, surely, we can't just tell everybody they're amazing, and we can't just recruit anybody into the industry, even if they know nothing at all about IT. So we have to have some way of judging whether people are any good or not. Yeah, I mean, when you're recruiting, depending on what you're recruiting for, then you are going to care about what skills people have. But there are different ways of thinking about skill. So if you think about aptitude and attitude, those are much more useful than whether or not they know about widgets. Now, if you need somebody to hit the ground running, then you might need them to have some experience of the technologies that you're working with, and that's fine. But it's possible to be quite generic about these things. For instance, C# developers can pick up Java really easily, even if they've never done it before, and vice versa. There are a lot of skills that are transferable. And if you have somebody who loves to learn new stuff and wants to put the effort in, that's what you need on your teams, particularly people who are also prepared to share those skills and help other people to learn. And interestingly as well, so I've had people say to me, you know what though, I've seen it happen where we've recruited somebody who said they knew about widgets, but when they got through the door, they clearly didn't. And that was really problematic for us because they were actually lying about what they could do. They were lying about what they knew. They couldn't actually do what we needed them to be able to do. Well, what I would say to that is the more you judge people based on their knowledge, the more you're encouraging people to lie to you about their knowledge. What you want is to create environments where it's okay to say, I know about this and I don't know about this. I've got an aptitude for this. I'd really love to learn about this. If that's okay, then people don't need to lie to you about their skills. And it also means that you can be prepared to say, listen, you know what, I'm going to take on this person who's never done Java development before because they have done C# and I think they'll be able to learn. And I think we'll be able to help them learn. And that's something that I want to encourage. So when is it unreasonable to judge people? I think there are many, many ways in which it's not reasonable. So for instance, it's not reasonable to assume that just because somebody hasn't reached the level you want them to reach, that therefore they never will. It's not reasonable to project a sheen of knowledge around yourself to protect yourself, because that's something that's really common, is that you encourage people to think that you know more than you do because you're worried about how they will judge you. You think that you're just protecting yourself, but what you're actually doing is making things harder for everybody else, because you're making people believe that they're supposed to know that stuff too, and you don't. So it's not reasonable to let them think that they're supposed to. It's much better to acknowledge what you know and what you don't know. I will be eternally grateful to all the colleagues I've ever had who've admitted to me when they were confused, who've been quite happy to Google stuff in front of me, who have been able to say, you know what, I don't know much about that. Or even the other thing, I used to know about that, but I've forgotten. Because that's something that happens a lot. And anytime that anybody has ever admitted those things to me, it's made my life easier, and it's made me more confident to admit that I didn't know either. And in a team, you need people to admit those things, because as a team, you need to make sure everybody knows what they're doing. And if you judge people for not knowing what they're doing, you're just encouraging them to lie about it. It's not reasonable to limit yourself by seeking to preserve knowledge once you have it. So that's something that people do as well, because they're scared, because they feel insecure. They'll become an expert in a particular domain, and then that's my comfort zone now. I'm just staying here. Everything's fine here. Well, it's not going to stay fine, and it's not going to help your team members. So actually, we all need to embrace learning. We all need to be prepared to step outside those comfort zones, because they don't last. It's not okay to not put yourself in other people's shoes. So when you meet somebody who doesn't know something that you know, remember what it felt like when you didn't know the thing that you know. Try and imagine what it feels like, because you do know you weren't born a software engineer. So if you try and remember what it felt like when you were learning, then you can help other people to learn. It's not okay to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but then distance yourself from it. So what can happen is that you remember full well what it felt like to not know the thing that you now know, and you didn't like it, and you don't want to be associated with it, and you don't want to be reminded of it. So you distance yourself from people who are in that situation, which is, again, not helpful. And it's not reasonable to not really think about what is required for somebody to be competent, either as a fellow team member. I talk a lot about recruitment, but I'm not assuming that you're all going to be involved in recruitment. So it's not just about recruitment. It's also simply about how you treat each other as team members. So I told the sad story at the beginning. I told about how I left the industry, didn't really want to be in IT anymore, and obviously I am now in IT again. So there was a 4-year period when I had nothing to do with IT. I actually retrained as a high school maths teacher, which didn't go very well. In fact, it was a total disaster. So to be honest, I wouldn't recommend it. But then I ended up in a position where I didn't have a job. So there was then a question of, oh, what do I do now? And I had 12 years experience as a software engineer. So I thought, I guess I'm going to have to do that again. It had been 4 years since I'd last done it, and I hadn't intended to come back. So I hadn't kept track. I hadn't been paying attention to what was happening in the industry. I had completely turned my back on it. So I was very out of date, very rusty. Not only was there a 4-year gap, but when I'd been in my previous role, I'd actually been working on technologies that were outdated anyway. So my skills were already stagnating at that point. And then I came back in, but the reason this is a happy story is I deliberately came back in at entry level. I came back in a company that specialized in taking on grads and training them up, which meant that I got to be trained up. And I was completely honest. I said, look, I just pretend I don't know anything, because I feel like I don't know anything. And the great thing about that was that I could be honest about not knowing stuff. And I was also working for a company that specialized in training up grads. I was working alongside people who were learning in a culture that explicitly fostered and encouraged learning. In fact, when I was interviewed for that job, I was told that people were sacked for not asking enough questions, which is maybe going a bit far. But the explicit culture was one of asking and answering questions, which meant that I got to embrace learning. I got to get excited about all the things that were happening in IT and not feel like I had to hide that. And the revelation was that the more I asked questions and the more I admitted what I didn't know, the more respect I got. And I honestly, so that was about 6 years ago. And in the last 6 years, my career's just gone like that, and I'm now a technical lead for an international global consultancy with a really high technical reputation. I'm doing really well. And part of that is because I deliberately admit when I don't know things. And there are ways of doing that. So if I were to go around the place going, stupid, I don't understand, I didn't explain that because I don't really get it, that wouldn't work. That people would judge me for that. They shouldn't, but they would. So instead of doing that, what I do is I lay out very clearly what I understand and what I don't understand, what I know and what I don't know. So I'll say, this bit here, I get that bit. That bit over there, I get that bit. This bit in the middle, I haven't managed to piece that together yet. So I can intelligently explain where the gaps in my knowledge are, and I can do it with confidence. I do it on the assumption that I won't be judged for it. I present my knowledge gaps to people saying, hey, I'm a human being, there's stuff I don't know, and I don't think that's a problem. And because I do it confidently, it actually has an impact on how people treat me, view me. But the one thing that I haven't found is that people have just, completely dismissed me, or not given me a job, or sacked me from a job, or anything like that. Actually, I get really positive responses from people. And part of what I'm doing, because I'm now in a senior position, I'm now in a position of leading teams, is I'm modeling that behavior for other people. I'm saying to the people who are junior in the team, by implication, you know what, if you don't know stuff, it's fine. If you have a really simple question that you want to ask, that's fine too. If people are using initials that you don't get, but you think you're supposed to, it's fine to put your hand up and say, you know what, I've forgotten what that means. Remind me. Or you know what, I've never heard of that before. What is that? And that's fine. And it should be fine. And we should be encouraging people to do that. And by doing that, I now really enjoy my job, because I can get excited about learning. And I can encourage other people to get excited about learning. So I've created something that I call the Stupidity Manifesto. This quote on the bottom is from a guy called Aaron Schwartz, who used to work for ThoughtWorks. Sadly, he died in 2013. But he says, be curious, read widely, try new things. What people call intelligence just boils down to curiosity. So if you have an attitude of wanting to learn and wanting to find out more, constantly asking questions, that's intelligence. Be curious. Don't feel like you have to shut yourself down. So the manifesto, it starts, let's stop making people feel stupid. Instead, let's have an explicit policy of curiosity towards all things. Let's encourage each other to shout out if we see each other discouraging curiosity amongst other people. Let's ask what people need to know, not what they do know. Let's never judge someone because their knowledge doesn't match ours. Let's give our colleagues every opportunity to learn and explore without risk. Because if people feel that there is a risk to learning and exploring, then what you get is non-optimal solutions, because people won't explore the best alternatives. Let's give new people a chance to show us what they can do. Ask them, what are their strengths, instead of having a predetermined list of strengths and trying to match them up to it. Let's encourage everyone to ask questions. And let's acknowledge the broad range of knowledge in our industry, because the range of knowledge in our industry is very wide. It's really, really, really big. So in ThoughtWorks, we have an internal message. We've got several internal message forums, but one of them is explicitly focused around software development. And it's being used by 4,000 people all over the globe. So new threads come into your inbox constantly. And these words on the screen were examples that I found when I made this slide, which was earlier this year. They were words that were in thread titles that I have on occasion wondered, I don't really know what that is. Or I know what it is, but I don't feel confident to contribute to a thread talking about it. Now, my perception is that all of these people who are my very friendly co-workers who let me take photos of them at a social occasion, these people all know about these things because their names are on these threads. They're all supremely confident and they know all this stuff. And then here's me in the middle, confused, worried, insecure. Now, the problem is that when you look at the world that way, what you're not taking account of is that the other people so this is my colleague Andy, he might have only contributed to one of those threads. He's looking at all of the other threads going, what the hell? I don't know what these people are talking about. And in fact, everybody is in a situation where they're looking out at people appearing confident, but they're not necessarily feeling confident. And it's very easy to look at all of these people talking about all of these things and thinking that everybody knows all the things. Everybody doesn't know all of the things. Some people know some of the things, and there are a lot of things. So rather than worrying about the size of the problem space, think about what you do know and think about what you can learn. But also remember that IT is gigantic. And you could find 2 highly competent, highly experienced software developers or just software professionals who've been in the industry for 20 years and have no overlap. That they are both amazing, but this person doesn't know any of the things that this person knows, and vice versa. And that's not even unusual. So rather than worry about what people don't know, recognize that if they're going to function and if you're going to function, they're going to have to learn new things, and there will have to be things that they don't know, and that's okay. I love this. This is an XKCD cartoon, the Lucky 10,000. So I will read it out because there's a lot of words there. What he's saying is, I try not to make fun of people for admitting they don't know things, because for each thing, everyone knows. So we've got this concept, there are some things that just everybody knows, obviously. So each one of those things that supposedly everyone knows, by the time they're adults, every day there are, on average, 10,000 people in America who are hearing about it for the first time. And then he's done a bit of maths. So he's saying nobody knows it when they're born. By the time everybody's 30, everybody knows it, so that's 100%. And then he works out the US birth rate, 4 million a year. So therefore, the number hearing about it for the first time is going to be 10,000 people a day. Now, what he's saying is, if I make fun of people, then I'm training them not to tell me when they have that moment of learning about the thing for the first time, which means that he misses out on the fun. And he gives the example of the Diet Coke and Mentos thing. For those people who don't know about the Diet Coke and Mentos thing, if you put a Mento in a bottle of Diet Coke, it creates a kind of an explosion, and it goes up into the air like a fountain, and it's all very exciting. So he's then describing the moment where somebody says to him, Diet Coke and Mentos thing, what's that? Oh man, come on, we're going to the grocery store. Why? You're one of today's lucky 10,000. So you're one of the lucky people who doesn't know about the thing. And the reason you're lucky for not knowing about the thing is that now you get to learn about the thing. And learning is exciting. And if you have that attitude to it, then not only do you encourage other people to get excited about learning instead of insecure about ignorance, you also get to go on that journey with them. So you get to share knowledge and help people to learn things rather than just dismissing them for not knowing whatever it is you think they're supposed to know. So there's more of the manifesto. Let's stop making each other feel stupid. Instead, let's remember our industry never stays the same. We all forget stuff. So it's not just about not knowing stuff, it's about forgetting it and then having to learn it again. Lead by example. Let's be honest when we're confused. Let's focus on aptitude, not knowledge. And let's remember what it feels like when we're still learning. Prioritize clarity over jargon. Now, it's fine that we use shorthand. We use words to describe things that we all have a common shared understanding, so we don't have to describe everything from scratch all the time. That's fine. But you just need to be aware when you're using shorthand that some people might not have come across it before, or they might have forgotten. So check that people are understanding. One of the things that we use a lot in ThoughtWorks is diagrams. Get people to draw things out, because it's a really good way of checking your understanding if you try and draw a diagram. It's a really good way of checking somebody else's understanding if you ask them to draw a diagram. And it's a really good way of communicating and sharing understanding, because quite often a diagram will illustrate that actually you had two different ways of understanding something. And remember that everything I'm talking about is not idealism. So you might think, oh, yeah, she's living in cloud cuckoo land. I'm not being idealistic, I'm being pragmatic, because I'm saying that teams can't function if team members don't know stuff. Companies can't recruit if they insist that everybody has to know something before they join the company. And you need people to learn new things, which means that you need them to be able to admit when they don't. So let's stop making each other feel stupid. Here are some of the things that I've mentioned during the talk. I can share slides afterwards. The interesting thing about stereotype threat, actually, I didn't mention it in this talk, because the last time I did, somebody challenged some of the research that I cited. So there's a little bit of a question over some of the research behind that, but you can read up on it. Delusions of Gender is a fantastic book by a woman called Cordelia Fine, where she talks about a lot of this so-called science around women's brains. So people quite often quote various studies that have measured the size of various portions of women's brains and suggested that therefore women can't do logical tasks, or they can't do map reading because they've got this bit of their brain that is typically smaller than a man. Absolute nonsense. There are lots of parts of your brain that will grow if you exercise them. So, for instance, if you bring up a boy and encourage him to use Lego every day, a bit of his brain will grow. And it will be bigger than a girl who's only ever been given dolls to play with. That doesn't mean that girls can't do Lego. It means that your brain will grow according to what stimuli you're given. It's also much more complicated than that. And actually, you can't just say, oh, we'll measure this bit and we'll measure this bit. There's an awful lot of cross-pollination. So I won't go into detail, but she does in her book, and it's really interesting. April Wenzel is an American who talks a lot about compassionate coding. She's got a blog and a website. She talks about software development that values humans. She talks about a lot of the same things that I've been talking about. There's links to a few of my blog posts around women wanting to join IT, or anybody starting a career in tech. And also my In Simple Terms blog is where I try to explain things in simple terms, mainly for my own benefit, but also the idea being that you don't have to use complex language all the time.